Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. This show is made possible by the McPherson Tax Defense Group, serving Alaskans, the nation since 1978 with 2 generations of tax defense attorneys. 1-800-BEAT-IRS, beatirs.com. That's BEAT-IRS. We have with us Emily Fuentes. She's the communications director at Open Doors USA. Since 2005, Ms. Fuentes has been working to bring the voices of religiously persecuted to the attention of Americans, and she's traveled to all the continents in the world. She's been recently in China, Colombia, Nigeria, and Turkey, holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Communications from Vanguard University and a Master's from Northwest Missouri State University. Ms. Fuentes, welcome to the Joe Miller Show.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with just a brief overview of Open Doors USA. What is the organization? What does it do? How can people learn more about it?
Sure. So Open Doors started in 1955 when our founder, a man named Brother Andrew, went on a trip to Poland because he had heard that Christians were facing extreme persecution at the time with the Soviet Union. So when he went there, he was amazed to see that entire churches were completely shut down and congregations were forced to go underground. So he felt it to be his life calling to deliver Bibles and help those who are persecuted for their faith. And so our organization actually started with him delivering Bibles to closed countries. And today, more than 60 years later, we're now working in over 60 countries where Christians face persecution. And our ministries expanded beyond delivering Bibles, but to really helping Christians however persecution materializes. So in some countries it can be violent attacks like Nigeria, and Christians need their homes and churches rebuilt, or Iraq, where there's a great need for trauma counseling and refugee aid. Then other countries where it's more of a systematic persecution, where women and children and Christians are not allowed to get an education and then are stuck in generations of poverty. And so we help by providing job skills training and education there too. So like I said, it materializes in a lot of different ways, and so we just work with the local church to see what their greatest needs are.
And Brother Andrew, just so that our listeners understand, of course, he was responsible for smuggling lots of Bibles to the Iron Curtain, and of course has written several books. What are those books that, if people want to know more about Brother Andrew, they can get a hold of?
Yeah, definitely. So his main book that's sold millions of copies throughout the years is God Smuggler, and that's where he accounts of how the ministry started and smuggling Bibles into multiple countries, impossible feats, really. And so it's really his autobiography about all that's happened there. Another big book that he co-authored is called Life Force, which talks about Christianity in the Middle East and the impact that persecution and terrorism is having, as well as Christians' relationships with Muslims.
So let's talk a little bit about where the world's at today as far as persecution goes. Are things getting better or worse? And give us kind of an overview of what Christians are facing in various regions of the world.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, in 2014, it was an unprecedented year of persecution in the modern era. We hadn't seen the number of incidences as well as violent attacks really at all in the modern era. And sadly, 2015 is continuing with that trend. We are seeing that governments are blatantly persecuting Christians in countries like Sudan, where in 2014 we saw Miriam Ibrahim, the mother of 2 who was sentenced to death for her faith. And thankfully, because of the outcry of the international community, was released. The same thing is now happening to 2 South Sudanese pastors who were just released but are currently, for the past week, been held up at the airport. They're not letting them leave the country for lots of reasons. And so we see it through government persecution, but we're seeing it very strongly through terrorist groups. The Islamic State is gaining more and more terrorist groups pledging allegiance to them, and so the Christians are seen as the minority that these groups are attacking throughout multiple countries throughout the world. And then we do see it again, as we mentioned earlier, the systematic persecution. It's becoming more violent. Christians may not have access to food and other vital resources just because they're Christians, or aren't able to have access to jobs because they're Christians. And so we're seeing that materialize.
So primarily the increase in persecution is occurring in Muslim-dominated areas. Is that correct?
We see it the most there, though we are seeing it increase in other countries too, through other factors that might be more government agents that are anti-Christian but not necessarily Muslim. And so you'll see that, like in North Korea, for example, on our World Watch list, it's the number one country for 13 years in a row, the worst place to be a Christian. That's a government that's just solely against Christians but isn't necessarily Muslim. And so you see that in a few countries, but the biggest force is indeed extremism in Islam.
I'm really surprised to hear you say that there are issues in South Sudan, because, again, that was kind of carved out of Sudan in part because of the civil war that had taken place and the southern Sudan being primarily fairly high density of Christians. Is the government in South Sudan, is it Muslim-controlled now, or are there Christians that are present in that government?
So to clarify with that case, these were two South Sudanese pastors who were visiting Sudan. Now the government of Sudan is holding them and not letting them leave to South Sudan. But unfortunately, we are seeing even cases in South Sudan where there's persecution, not necessarily from the government, but from neighbors and hostility through societal persecution there, even though, we're hoping that through the break-off and the building of a new country that would go away. It has not completely.
So you mentioned that ISIS, or the Islamic State, is expanding its control. Apparently, there have been a number of other groups that have aligned themselves with ISIS. Tell our listeners a little bit about that and how that's going to expand the persecution against Christians.
Yeah, so the Islamic State declared the caliphate in June of 2014, last year. So it's been a little bit over a year, and that was just in part of Syria and part of Iraq. Now, since that time, there have been more than 30 terrorist groups who have sworn allegiance to the Islamic State, basically like saying we are now the Islamic State. And this even includes like humongous terrorist groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria. They are now declaring themselves part of the Islamic State. So these groups that are swearing allegiance are throughout the world. We're seeing it in Sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, East Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East, and now even parts of Southeast Asia, like the Philippines. And so it is spreading rapidly, and people are swearing allegiance going over there to fight. Some are remaining in their own countries. We've gotten reports, like in Central Asia, of people who have sworn allegiance to the Islamic State threatening Christians, their Christian neighbors now. And so it's spreading rapidly because of the unified clause that they have.
And is there like a directive, or is there part of the, I guess, process of giving allegiance over to ISIS that then requires them to act with hostility toward Christians, or is there any direct connection to that extent as far as what they later do as far as persecution goes?
So the Islamic State's mantra really is that they believe that they are bringing about the end of the world. They believe they're in apocalyptic times and in an apocalyptic group. And so to them, anyone who is not following their ideology, I suppose, is seen as a threat and someone that they must either force to flee out of their region or kill. Oftentimes, sadly, we're seeing killing. And so Christians are the primary target because they are minorities, but other minorities are facing troubles, and even in some cases, moderate Muslims are facing trouble because they aren't seen as extreme enough to be part of this group or to be allowed to live in their area. And so Christians definitely have that extra target and are especially targeted by the Islamic State just because they're seen as people with the cross is what they've referred to them a lot as. You might have seen that in those articles that were referencing the Egyptians who were beheaded earlier this year, and same with the Ethiopians. They keep referring to them as people with the cross and targeting them.
We only have about 30 seconds left in this segment, but as far as Open Doors personnel goes, do you have personnel on the ground, or do you primarily work through local groups and simply bring people across when you need to help bring in supplies? What's kind of the staffing arrangement?
Yeah, so we have people on the ground in all of these 60 countries that we work in, but we work side by side with the local church to understand their needs best.
Fantastic. Emily Fuentes, the Director of Communications for Open Doors USA. She's going to stay with us for another segment. Be back with you after these messages. The Joe Miller Show. Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We have with us Emily Fuentes. She's the Communication Director at Open Doors USA. Since 2005, she's worked to bring the voices of the religiously persecuted to the attention of Americans. Open Doors is working in 60 countries helping persecuted Christians, which, according to Open Doors, have faced unprecedented persecution, 2014 being one of the worst years in recent history, and 2015 a continuation of that as well. Ms. Fuentes, thank you for staying with us on the Joe Miller Show to share with us on this important topic.
Oh, thank you so much for highlighting it.
So one of the things that we talked about during the break is that ISIS, of course, very brutal in its approach, Syria, Iraq, it's forced their activities, and of course the activities of others, have forced many Christians out of these areas. In fact, Iraq had a historic Christian community that had been extant since the time of Christ, almost just shortly after that. And now Iraq has lost a great percentage of its Christians. Do you have any idea how many Christians are left in Iraq, how many that represents of the original group that was there before this persecution started?
Yeah, so sadly only a few thousand remain in Iraq. Between Iraq and Syria, more than 300,000 Christians have fled because of persecution from ISIS. But Iraq, the whole other element, too, that we're looking at is if we look at the past 12 years. In 2003, there were well over 1 million Christians, closer to 2 million. And since that time, there have been extremist groups coming in and attacking Christians and forcing them to flee out of the country. And so by the time ISIS came around, there were only a few 100,000 left in the country compared to the more than 1 million that were there before. So it basically had disintegrated to about 10% of what it once was. And then after ISIS, it took that remaining 10%, and now there's only just a few thousand left. And this is essentially the birthplace of Christianity, this region. So many stories in the Bible and all of that, so it's historically significant to have that few Christians left.
And it's amazing to me that this significant number that have left Iraq occurred under American watch. I mean, most of this happened during the last 14 years, 13 years that we've been the power broker in the area. Isn't that right?
Yeah, we saw a major increase with the war in Iraq when it started, and so 2003 was really when we started to see the mass exodus of Christians in the region, and it's just sadly snowballed and continued ever since that time. And yeah, just to have a few thousand Christians remaining in Iraq compared to what it was just 12 years ago is just absolutely mind-blowing to think how fast it can actually happen and did happen.
And the same thing now is happening in Syria, correct?
Exactly, yeah. There's a Christian, and Syria was even more of a Christian country than Iraq, and we're seeing people both internally displaced and then those who have been forced to flee the country. And again, in Syria, it's bad for everyone, but Christians are especially targeted.
Now, we've heard a number of stories coming out of Syria of Christians being kidnapped by ISIS, and it seems like every week there's another story about a large part of a town being kidnapped, kids, women sold into sex slavery. Tell us a little bit about what ISIS is doing in Syria. One of the things that's a little bit confusing to a lot of our listeners is, you have these folk that claim to be adherents to Islam, and yet report after report after report suggests that they're using these kidnapped individuals for purposes of sex. And it's horrific. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and then tell us what the justification is religiously for them doing that?
Sure. So in Syria specifically, ISIS is being quite strategic in how they are taking out Christians. Like I said, it's bad for everyone, but Christians are specifically targeted. So they are targeting historically Christian communities and villages, in some cases destroying every Christian within that village. And these are villages that have been around for thousands of years. So they know who they're attacking and what they're doing. And many of these times we see that they're killing the men, as we've seen sadly with those videos that have surfaced, or just attacking them. And then they're keeping the women. And we're seeing a huge, not only in Iraq and Syria, but other places where where groups have sworn allegiance to the Islamic State, like northern Nigeria. They're taking women and kidnapping them and either selling them into sex slavery or are forcing them into Islamic extremist marriages. Now, the Islamic State views themselves as an apocalyptic group. They claim to be followers of Sharia law and a very strict version of Islam, and so that's why they're attacking all these groups. They believe that they're going to bring about the apocalypse by doing this. But we are seeing a great deal of hypocrisy, as you mentioned. That they're not following parts of the Quran, and they don't have any real justification for why they're taking these women and keeping them as sex slaves and forced marriages. This is it's something that moderate Muslims are standing against in their community, and thus they begin to be attacked by the Islamic State too. So that we're seeing a lot of inconsistencies. It's really just a bunch of people who are promoting really evil in this region.
We've got a caller that's standing by. Regina, welcome to the Joe Miller Show. Do you have a comment or a question for Ms. Fuentes?
Actually, I have both. When you have a heart for the poor, for children, or for persecuted Christians, there's some other organizations that we all know about, Compassion International and Operation Christmas Child, for reaching out and actually touching into the lives of poor and disadvantaged children across the globe. And obviously, Open Doors is a major piece of that puzzle for reaching out to Christians who are persecuted. But I was just wondering, because I was on your website looking at the letter writing, I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about the impact of the letter writing that we can do from our homes to encourage our brothers and sisters in Christ across the world. And if you have any feedback on that impact or any current moves in that area, that would be great.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your question and checking out our website. With the letter writing campaign, we know it's one of the greatest ways to encourage people who have been through a great deal of persecution. Recently, we were actually able to deliver some letters of encouragement, and by some I mean thousands, to the parents of the Chibok girls in Nigeria, many who are still missing. And it's just a great source of encouragement, I think, especially more than a year later, for them to know they're not forgotten about, that people care, that Christians are praying for them, that they're still trying to find their daughters. Likewise, with those who have lost husbands or have faced other forms of great persecution, these letter writing campaigns, these letters, when they see that people around the world remember what they're going through and are actually carrying it, it brings a great deal of encouragement. So yes, we love when people write letters, and it's a joy to be able to deliver it to persecuted Christians. I've been able to myself before, and it's a remarkable thing to see.
Thank you, Regina, for that call. And if people want to contribute to that or get involved with the letter writing, what is the website for Open Doors?
Sure. Our website is opendoorsusa.org.
Now, one of the things that we talked about during the break, apparently there's actually some good news out of Syria. Recently, there were 22 Christians that were released by ISIS. Tell our listeners a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it was some really remarkable news, something that hasn't really quite happened like this before, where they had released 22 of those who had been kidnapped. The Syrian Christians had been kidnapped, and in this case, it was primarily all elderly people. So sadly, we still have many children, women, and men who are still being held captive by ISIS. But it is remarkable that even some were let go, and so our prayer and our continued voices that more can be released and will be released. But we are thankful for the small amount that were.
Well, I appreciate the work that you're doing, Ms. Fuentes, the work that Open Doors is doing. OpenDoorsUSA.org. People can donate there. You can get involved with the letter writing campaign. Ms. Fuentes, you yourself have traveled all across the world. You've seen much of this. I know that has not been without risk. We'll keep you in our prayers. Thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Stay with us, The Joe Miller Show. We'll be right back with Admiral Lyons talking about some pressing issues on the Iran deal. Stay with us.